Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 9 in our Understanding International Relations lectures. We will have a look today at social constructivism, which became very successful after the end of the Cold War, due to the context of the end of the Cold War, and also due to its capacity to propose a kind of way out of the so-called fourth debate in the discipline of international relations, sometimes called the third debate in American handbooks, because they forget what I consider to be the third one. The fourth debate opposing positivists to post-positivists. So we will first have a look at the context, historical context of the end of the Cold War. Then we will very quickly sum up post-positivism and its specificities before coming and dedicating the most important part of today's chapter to social constructivism, which I therefore distinguish from post-positivism. So when I use the term social constructivism, I mean what has sometimes been called conventional constructivism or soft constructivism or modernist constructivism. So the historical background first, the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War, 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down by the citizens of Berlin, both West and East. 1991, the USSR definitely collapsed. And basically, the end of the Cold War is due to what has been called Gorbachev's new approach. Gorbachev became the Secretary General of the USSR in 1985 after the death of two secretaries within 3 years. They themselves had succeeded to Brezhnev, who had died in 1982. Gorbachev was aware of the many limits of the Soviet Union. So what did he do? He decided to introduce different reforms that he called glasnost, political reform, in order to introduce a little bit of pluralism in the then Soviet regime. The perestroika, that is to say, tried to reform the Soviet economy somehow, as Lenin had done with his new political economy in the 1920s after the Bolshevik Revolution. Gorbachev's domestic reforms failed, and this is probably the reason why the USSR collapsed a bit later. But he was very successful on the international scene, where this new approach ended up putting an end to the Cold War. Why? Because he, to some extent, proved to the US that the USSR was no longer America's enemy. So very concretely, he proposed a general disarmament process to Ronald Reagan, the then American president. They met in Reykjavik and decided to sign the START agreements, the strategic arms reduction talks, a step further when compared to the strategic armaments limitation talks, which went back to the 70s. He decided to withdraw the Soviet Red Army from Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. 10 years later, they had been completely unable to control the political situation in Afghanistan. So Gorbachev drew the conclusion that the troops should be withdrawn. And last but not least, he abandoned the so-called Brezhnev doctrine, that is to say, the doctrine of limited sovereignty that the Soviets applied in their relations with the Eastern European so-called popular democracies, that is to say, the fact that these Eastern European and Central European states had to remain communist. He replaced this doctrine by the so-called Sinatra doctrine, that is to say, he permitted these Eastern European states, Eastern Germany, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., to adopt their way, the song of Sinatra, My Way, their way of achieving socialism. The populations concerned got rid of socialism, and thus the Cold War came to an end. Nobody, ladies and gentlemen, had foreseen the end of the Cold War. I was a student in Paris at the beginning of the 1980s, and my teachers, very brilliant, and also very anti-communist, believed, this is what they told us, that the Soviet totalitarianism was somehow irreversible. So nobody expected that 5 years later there was no more USSR. In the discipline of international relations, we saw this last week in chapter 8. Kenneth Waltz, since he postulated the stability of the bipolar Cold War, had come to the conclusion that the Cold War would last pretty long. He said that the superpower club composed by the US and USSR, I quote, will long remain the world's most exclusive one, the world's most exclusive one. He was wrong. And the neoliberals who debated with the neorealists regarding the domain of cooperation, well, to some extent, they implicitly applied their neoliberal institutional theory to international economic relations. And in the 1980s, there were no significant economic relations between the East and West. So they did not even conceive of the possibility of the Cold War coming to an end because of the decline of the Eastern European camp and of the communist doctrine. Anyway, since both neorealists and neoliberals were absolutely unable to explain, to predict the end of the Cold War, they lost somehow a bit of their credibility. Nowadays, it is, of course, possible with today's hindsight to explain why Gorbachev adopted the new approach. Realists would say that he did so because he was aware of the Soviet Union's inferiority. This is a realist explanation. The power ratio was favorable to the US. Basically, the structure of the Cold War was as much unipolar because of America's economic predominance as it was bipolar because of the nuclear balance of terror. And liberals or transnationalists would say that Gorbachev ended up adopting his reforms because of the triumph of Western ideas, of Western values, of Western principles, those ones that had been adopted at the Helsinki Conference 1975, and which contributed to undermine the legitimacy of the communist ideas of the communist regime in the eyes, in the mind of the populations in the countries concerned themselves. Anyway, the failure to predict at the end of the Cold War paved the way to a new approach in international relations, since the two major ones in the 1980s had been unable to predict the end of the Cold War. So indirectly, this benefited to another approach, social constructivism. And social constructivism itself is the consequence of the fourth debate opposing positivists to post-positivists during the second half of the 1980s. So let's have a look at this fourth debate, and let's have a look at the meaning of post-positivism. Post-positivism, by definition, is distinguished from positivism. Positivism is a term which goes back to the French sociologist Auguste Comte, who in the second half of the 19th century had claimed that the world had arrived at the positivist or the positivist age, that is to say, dominated by science, positive science, as opposed to past centuries, to past periods where religion and metaphysics were prevailing. Positivism claims that in the domain of social sciences, that social sciences are absolutely perfectly similar to natural sciences. Soft sciences are similar to hard sciences. That is to say, just as there is an objective world, trees are objective, the sun is objectively existing, etc., etc., so the social reality is objectively existing, whatever those who study it may think of it. the social reality, the social processes, the social events are due to objective causes, which exist independently from those who study these causes. The aim of social sciences, just as the aim of hard sciences, is to study these causes which regularly occur, and therefore the aim is to discover universal laws. Remember the example I gave you in my introduction. Why does the pen fall to the floor? Because of the universal law of gravity. There are similar universal laws in social sciences and therefore in our discipline of international relations. Why do wars regularly break out? According to classical realists, because of human nature. According to neorealists, because of the anarchical structure. According to liberals, because of autocratic regimes, etc., etc. The explanations are different from one paradigm to another, but every paradigm taken individually, each approach believes that its explanation is similar to the universal explanation of gravity. And all these mainstream or positivist theories believe that it is possible to confront their explanations to the empirical reality. These postulates, these hypotheses, these starting points or assumptions that characterize all the positivists, be they realists or liberals or transnationalists or even Marxists, these postulates are rejected by post-positivists. So post-positivists actually introduced in social sciences in general, and therefore also in international relations, a kind of preliminary question, an epistemological question: is scientific study actually possible or not? Scientific study of the social reality in social sciences in general, sociology, economy, political science, etc., and therefore also in international relations. Is international relations as a scientific discipline, an academic discipline, possible or not? This question had never been asked by positivists, because they spontaneously posited, they spontaneously postulated that yes, it is possible to study scientifically international relations. Post-positivists are much more skeptical, and somehow they end up coming to a negative response to this question. No, it is not possible to scientifically study international relations, scientifically in the meaning of applying the hard or natural sciences methods to the study of international relations. Their questions were the following ones: is a scientific the scientific study of international relations possible? Is scientific knowledge possible? Does this knowledge consist in explaining or in understanding? Is there a link between theory and practice? Should scientific theories be practically useful or not? Is there a difference between knowledge and ideology or doctrine or common sense discourse or not? Is scientific knowledge a form of power in general? Or is it an example of male power as claimed by feminists? We come back to them. Are the concepts that we use universally valid, or are they only valid in some specific context of time and of space, etc., etc.? Is it possible to come close to the truth or not, etc., etc.? These questions were raised by post-positivists, whom we can group into four different types. The first one is the so-called critical theory in the strict meaning of critical theory, that is to say, inspired directly by the critical Marxist Gramsci of the interwar period, and also by the German theorists belonging to the so-called Frankfurter Schule, Frankfurt School. Robert Cox is the most important adherent to this critical approach. We can add also the British Andrew Linklater, we'll come back to them in a few minutes. The second group is composed by postmodernists, so-called postmodernists, Ashley, Darien, Walker. They are influenced by the so-called French theory. That is to say, the French sociology of the second half of the 20th century, 1960s, 70s, 80s, Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, who themselves go back to some extent to Heidegger, the philosophy of Heidegger and the philosophy of Nietzsche in Germany too. Then we have feminist scholars, those who introduced gender studies in the discipline of international relations, influenced by the French Simone de Beauvoir, by the American Judith Butler. We'll come back to them too in a very short time. And last but not least, post-colonialists, a more recent post-positivist approach, influenced by Frantz Fanon and his Ratchet of the Earth that was published in the 1950s, and the Palestinian scholar Edward Said, who published at the end of the 70s his very famous book called Orientalism. Post-colonialists are theorists coming from former territories, from states that in the past were colonial territories controlled by mainly European colonial powers, and they accuse the existing discipline of international relations to be Western-centric, therefore of not admitting non-Western approaches. So if we go beyond the specificities of these four approaches, two or three points I would like to emphasize, to give you an idea of what post-positivism is. Post-positivism in the discipline of international relations always represented a small minority, though a very active one, and even to some extent a fairly noisy, dynamic approach, given the theorists concerned who published their somehow revolutionary or radical ideas. So the main points are the following one. First of all, and we can sum up this in the following way. First of all, post-positivists claim that the knowledge produced in social science is not independent from the context within which it is embedded. That is to say, social scientists are influenced by their way of life, by the context which is theirs in their non-scientific environment. Just to sum up this idea, a white scholar, American, conservative, male, and straight, will not produce the same knowledge as a female, non-American, non-conservative, lesbian, Black scholar, because the context of the two scholars, ideal, typical scholars that I consider, are different. They do not look at the world through the same looking glasses, so they do not ask the same questions to the reality, and therefore they will not produce the same science. And Cox, for instance, summed up this idea by saying that theories can be divided into two kinds of theories: problem-solving theories and critical theories. Problem-solving theories are those theories, notably realist and liberal ones, whose aim implicitly or explicitly, sometimes unconsciously, is to make the existing world work smoothly. That is to say, it is a conservative theory, which does not ask where the existing world comes from. This is what critical theories do. They are eager to change the world. So the critical theory is somehow close to a Marxist tradition. It wants to change the world. It is driven by what we may call an emancipatory, a cognitive interest. The same idea, or an idea which is pretty close to this one, is put forward by feminists. Feminists accuse mainstream theories, such as the realist ones, but also the liberal ones, and even the Marxist ones. Feminists accuse these mainstream theories to be male-stream theories. That is to say, theories produced by male scholars who look at the world through masculine looking glasses. And Tickner, one of the very first feminist scholars in international relations, for instance, rightly so, claimed that there are no women in Thomas Hobbes's state of nature, which is the state of war, where men are wolves to one another, where women are only considered as one possession among other possessions of men. So women are not considered to be actors or agents. They are secondary. The aim then of feminist scholars is to propose a theory which takes into account, thanks to a female looking glass, to take into account the reality ignored by male scholars, that is to say, the 50 or 55% of female citizens that compose the world population too. Their aim is to empower female actors. Within feminism, then we have standpoint feminists, liberal feminists, Marxist feminists, post-colonial feminists, etc., etc. One more important point, the last one, for post-positivists in general, and this is an ontological claim. Not merely is social science influenced by the non-scientific environment, but the non-scientific environment, the political or social environment, is also impacted by the social science which aims at analyzing. That is to say, what we say about international political reality contributes to produce and sometimes to reproduce, to form and to transform, to conserve or to maintain or to keep the existing reality, and sometimes to change it, and maybe even to improve it. That is to say, knowledge co-constitutes the reality which it studies. Knowledge contributes to shape the reality we are living in. Take the example of the realist claim that we are living in a state of war. Imagine a decision maker, a statesman or stateswoman, accepting this realist analysis. What will this statesman or this stateswoman do? Well, it will make sure that his or her state will be able to cope with the dangers emanating from other states, given there is an all-encompassing state of war. What concretely will these decision makers do? Well, they will increase the state's military resources. In doing so, they will reproduce the state of war. That is to say, they will contribute to the state of war which they postulated as existing when they started acting. So social knowledge is not neutral. It contributes to the reality, which means that prospectively, potentially, there are as many realities as there are discourses about the reality, because each discourse will contribute to produce at least a partial reality. There are therefore only regimes of truth and not an objective, general, global truth. And this is the core point, the core argument of the postmodernists, who therefore end up in merely deconstructing existing theories in order not to contribute to reproduce regimes of truths which are actually regimes of oppression, of repression. Postmodernists are the most radical post-positivists. They merely deconstruct, that is to say, criticize existing theories without proposing any kind of alternative approach. So they are perfectly skeptical. This skepticism, ladies and gentlemen, ended up in what we may call a kind of dialogue of the deaf. Why? Because, of course, mainstream scholars or positive scholars do not consider themselves to be positivists, since the questions asked by post-positivists are not asked by positivists. These questions do not even come up to the mind of positivists because they have internalized the conviction that what they do is real science. So they reject the criticisms, and the post-positivists reject the rejection of the positivists. So there is a kind of dialogue of the deaf, which is not a dialogue. How then did this absence of genuine dialogue end? Well, it ended in a kind of via media, in a kind of compromise, which was proposed by the new approach called social constructivism. Social constructivists, it is a general approach in social sciences and therefore also in international relations, builds a kind of bridge between positivists and post-positivists. In doing what? Well, in combining a positivist epistemology with a post-positivist, or at least the non-positivist ontology. So according to social constructivists, the social reality, and therefore the international political reality, or the world political reality, is amenable to be studied, is liable to be scientifically studied. Yes, it is possible to produce scientific knowledge about social processes and therefore about international processes. This is the positivist epistemology. And then they combine this with a post or non-positivist ontology. That is to say, they claim that if it is possible to study scientifically the reality, it is because this reality, this social reality, is neither objective, as claimed by positivists, really existing out there objectively, nor is it completely subjective, a feminist reality, a post-colonial reality, a critical reality, a postmodernist reality, etc. The realist, the liberal, Marxist one. No, it is neither objective nor subjective, it is intersubjective. That is to say, it is socially constructed. The world of the social reality is our world, is what we make of it through our daily interactions, discourses, actions, relations. And the easiest way to understand the meaning of this intersubjectively, socially constructed reality was found by the American sociologist John Searle with his $1 bill. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine an alien from the planet Mars landing on with his spaceship on the planet Earth. What would he see? What would he see in my hands? He would see a piece of paper. The material objective reality of this $1 bill is to be a piece of paper. Why then do we consider it to be a $1? Because we agree when purchasing and selling goods, we agree in saying it is a social convention to agree in saying that this piece of paper is worth $1. This will work in the US, probably in Canada too, and maybe even in Mexico. Not sure that it will work in Africa, where African people do not ascribe to this piece of paper the socially constructed value of $1. So $1 is a socially constructed value, intersubjectively shared. If I go and claim in a supermarket and claim that this is $100, it will not work, because the other people with whom I will have social interactions will not consider this to be worth $100, but merely $1. So it is the social reality is intersubjectively constructed. And this argumentation then will be introduced in the discipline of international relations by a first scholar, Nicholas Onoff, who wrote a book called A World of Our Making. The social world is what we make of it. And the same expression will be used by Alexander Wendt, whom I consider to be the most important social constructivist scholar in the discipline of international relations. Alexander Wendt, with his article, Anarchy is what states make of it. Anarchy does not exist out there once and for all, as claimed by realists, but also to some extent by liberals. Anarchy is what states make of it. This was his article in 1992, the most famous article in the discipline of international relations. And in his book, published a bit later, 1999, Social Theory of International Politics. Social Theory of International Politics. You see the allusion, ladies and gentlemen, to Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics. That is to say, Alexander Wendt's social constructivist approach is an attempt to criticize the neorealist approach of Kenneth Waltz by proposing an alternative grand theory, permitting us, according to him, to better understand what international politics is all about. International politics, an important remark here, rather than world politics or even international relations. That is to say, since Alexander Wendt is interested in criticizing Kenneth Waltz, well, he must also focus on the same interactions. That is to say, interactions in the interstate domain of war and peace, of conflict and cooperation, or to use the terms put forward by Alexander Wendt himself, in the domain of violence and the regulation of violence. Alexander Wendt, therefore, is a state-centric scholar, because he considers that violence, first and foremost on the international scene, is mediated through states. Though he accepts, of course, that there are other actors, but he's not interested in studying them. He focuses on states. His approach is state-centric. Constructivists beyond Alexander Wendt are not necessarily state-centric. Everything depends on what they are interested in studying very concretely. Alexander Wendt is interested in studying how states behave in the domain of war and peace or violence, and the limitation of violence. How do they behave, and why do they behave the way they behave? This is his theoretical ambition, and he was so successful that ever since, I would say, the midst of the 1990s, for 2 decades now, 2 decades and a half, social constructivism has become the third major approach in the discipline of international relations. It replaced Marxism as the third approach, and the somehow critical, or at least neither realist nor liberal theory. I repeat what I already said. I hope I did already say it. Basically, the discipline of international relations consists in the confrontation opposing realism to liberalism in the different variants, classical realism, neorealism, and we will see this a bit later, neoclassical realism, 2 different kinds of liberalism, be they called idealism, neoliberalism, or even transnationalism. This is the basic confrontation. And then there is always a third approach, more or less important. It used to be a Marxism throughout the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, a bit the 80s. It nowadays is social constructivism for some 2 or 3 decades. So let's come back to Alexander Wendt's approach. Let's go into the details of his theory. He's interested in explaining, in describing and explaining the state's behavior. And he starts putting forward a claim which is very, very, at first sight, similar to the one of realists. This is what he said. No one denies that states act on the basis of a perceived interests. So states act according to their interests, and he immediately adds according to their national interests. So very close to Morgenthau's classical realism, and also implicitly to Kenneth Waltz's neorealism. So states act on the basis of their interests, and he goes on, few would deny that those interests are often egoistic. Very often the national interest is defined in egoistic terms, close to the realist claim. I certainly would not reject that, I quote. I certainly agree with the claim consisting in saying that states act on the basis of egoistically defined national interests. And he even adds, to that extent, I am a realist. To that extent, I am a realist. Page 113, 114 of his book, Social Theory of International Politics. But then he immediately makes clear that he's not a realist. Why? Because, I quote, interests should not be seen as an exclusively realist variable. Interests or national interests should not be considered as an exclusively realist variable. Why? Well, he then adds his social constructivist conception of interests. Interests basically refer to identities, to a state identity. What is an identity? What is the identity of a state or of an actor or an agent, such as you and me? Well, the identity of a state refers to the set of ideas states have about themselves and of other states. It refers to the ideas the states have about the place of the state on the world political scene, the role it is supposed to play, the rank it is, which it occupies on the world political scene, in the world political system. And according to Alexander Wendt, interests are defined by identities. The reason is the following. Well, listen to Alexander Wendt. An actor, in general, therefore a state, cannot know what it wants if it does not know what it is. Interests designate the objectives that states want to pursue. Identities refer to who actors are. Now, you cannot know what you want if you do not know who you are. What you pursue as an objective is based on your reality, on your identity as an actor or as an agent. And he gives a very concrete example of everyday life of a professor. A professor's interest is to propose interesting and seducing lectures in order for students to be interested in attending them. So my interest as a teacher is to propose interesting lectures. But this is only valid in an academic setting and when dealing with students interested in taking my classes. My identity will be different when I have intercourse with my wife as a husband, when I have interactions with my children as a father, or when I have an interaction with a policeman because I go through the red light. If I tell the policeman I'm a professor, this won't work. I will have to pay a fine, because I'm a guilty car driver if I go through the red light rather than stopping my car. So the identity of everybody depends on the context within which they are embedded. And the same is true for states. And states, just as individuals have more than one identity, a professor, a husband, a father, car driver, etc., etc. The same is true for states. States have different identities depending on the partner or the partners in their interaction. Let's take a very concrete example. The US. America's identity when dealing with the UK is to be a very close ally, to be a friend to some extent. We'll come back to this concept in a few minutes. When the US deals with France, the identity of the US as perceived by the French is a bit different. There is a kind of love-hate relationship between the French and the Americans. We know what happened some months ago during the fall of 2021. America managed to sell its submarines to Australia, which had promised to purchase French ones. France, Macron, etc., did not appreciate. So there is a kind of ambiguous relationship. Look at the relationship between Mexico or Venezuela, or more so, and the US. For Venezuela, the US is anything but a friend. It is an imperialist power. For Iran, it is the great Satan. For North Korea, it is an enemy. And this is true reciprocally. The US, of course, considers the UK to be a friend or to be a rival, to be a very close ally. But it does not consider Venezuela to be an ally. It considers Venezuela to be an autocratic dictatorship whose regime should change. Same is true for Iran, etc., etc. So the identities vary, are different depending on the interaction, the social interaction. And this identity then is reproduced, produced, changed according to the evolution of the different interactions. Let's come back to the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev decided that the USSR should be no more America's enemy. In doing so, Gorbachev transformed the relationship between the Soviets and the Americans from a hostile relationship between the states in a very harsh confrontation to an interaction where cooperation, or at least dialogue, was all the more probable. So the states' identities change according to the context within which states have interaction. And Wendt deduces from this starting point that in the domain of war and peace, and at the systemic level, the worldwide level, no more bilateral relations, but relations in general among states. At the systemic level, the way states perceive each other's identity, and act according to this perception, which is actually a socially shared conception, the way states conceive of each other, form a general culture, a systemic worldwide international culture, which he calls an anarchical culture because of anarchy characterizing international politics. You know that since my introductory chapter. And given that there are more than one identity, shared identity, intersubjectively constructed identity possible, there are not one, but more than one anarchical cultures or anarchical logics or anarchies. And Alexander Wendt actually comes to the conclusion that there are three anarchies. There are three anarchical cultures characterizing the relations among states, but also among non-state actors in the domain of war and peace or violence and the regulation of violence. He calls these three types of anarchy: the Hobbesian culture, the Lockean culture, and the Kantian culture. The Hobbesian culture exists when and as long as states is state-centric, but we can apply it to non-state actors. I will give a concrete example. The Hobbesian culture exists and prevails as long as states mutually, intersubjectively conceive of themselves as enemies. Enemies deny each other's right to exist as independent units. They observe no limit in the violence that they use when interacting with one another. This is the Hobbesian culture. It corresponds to Thomas Hobbes's picture, or at least to Alexander Wendt's interpretation of Hobbes's analysis of international politics put forward in the Leviathan. We summed it up very quickly in our chapter 7. The second type of anarchical culture is the Lockean anarchy. From John Locke's description, different from Thomas Hobbes's ones. According to John Locke, according to the Lockean culture, according to Wendt's concept of the Lockean culture, this one exists when states mutually consider one another as rivals. What is the meaning of rivals as opposed to, as distinguished from enemies? Rivals do recognize each other's right to exist as independent units, but they may nevertheless go to war against each other. This violence, however, which they use, which they resort to, is a limited violence. As you say, they do not try to annihilate each other. They do not try to destroy one another. We'll come back to concrete examples. And the third anarchy, the third anarchical culture is the Kantian culture. Immanuel Kant, we summed him up in our chapter 2, the idealist idea of democracies being peaceful. According to Alexander Wendt, the Kantian culture exists when and as long as states conceive of one another as friends. No more enemies, not even rivals, but friends. What does that mean? For states to be friends, according to Alexander Wendt's social constructivist theory, well, friends act on an altruistic basis. Their national interest is no more defined egoistically, but altruistically. That is to say, they no more go to war against one another. They do not even conceive of the possibility of going to war against one another. They have internalized the conviction that their conflicts, in the strict meaning of divergent interests, should and can be resolved peacefully, no more war. They form a security community as friends, and being friends, they also form a collective security system. That is to say, they help one another against third-party states, against threatening third-party states. We'll come back to a very concrete example. According to Alexander Wendt, these cultures, these sets of beliefs, of ideas that states share when dealing with one another, when interacting with one another, are internalized by states. That is to say, they have internalized them as beliefs. But there are 3 degrees of intensity of this internalization. That is to say, the 3 anarchical cultures can be internalized to 3 different degrees, at the first, at the second, and at the third degree. States can consider one another as friends somehow because they are forced to do so. This is to the first degree. Or they can end up becoming rivals, that is to say, recognizing another one's existence because they are smart enough to understand that it is their interest to do so. In this case, the anarchical culture, the Lockean anarchical culture, is internalized to the second degree. And last but not least, it is possible for an anarchical culture to be internalized to the third degree. That is to say, in this case, the culture is considered to be as such legitimate. It is not even questioned anymore. And by definition, the Kantian culture, the third one, where states conceive one another as friends, must be, I think, internalized to a third degree. You cannot be somebody else's friend if you are forced to do so. It's impossible. There's no more friendship. And not even if you're interested in being a friend. It is a kind of strange friendship, I think so. So to be a friend with somebody else rests on a spontaneously, deeply internalized sympathy shared by the two friends concerned. So friendship, that is to say, the Kantian culture, by definition, can only exist at the third degree, when it is internalized at the third degree. So let's have a look, ladies and gentlemen, at these three types of anarchy and at these 3 degrees of internalization throughout history. Because the aim of Alexander Wendt, of course, is to use this framework in order to better understand the international political or world political reality we are living in, and in order to distinguish it from past realities, given that the social reality is likely to change according to what states make of it on the basis of their internalized anarchical cultures. So the Hobbesian anarchy. The Hobbesian anarchy, according to Alexander Wendt, prevailed in the past. It prevailed during ancient times up to the Middle Ages. Why? Because at that time it was normal. It was internalized as normal to the third degree by the then political units, while it was normal for them to go to war, to practice offensive power politics called Machtpolitik. The law of the jungle was prevailing in the past, and therefore only empires survived, because the empires were created by those political units that were powerful enough to conquer the other ones, the weaker ones, and to integrate them into the empire. And empires did not interact with one another because they weren't able to defeat each other. So they ignored, they neglected one another. They were separated by walls, the levers, the Great Chinese Wall, etc., etc. So according to Alexander Wendt, up to the end of the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages, international politics took place in a Hobbesian anarchy of a war of everybody against prospectively everybody else. This is the Hobbesian description of the never-ending state of war. The political units did deny other political units right to exist, and therefore they killed them, they integrated them when they were powerful enough into their empire. Look at the example of the Roman Empire. It gradually integrated all the neighboring territories. But even later, when the Christians met Muslims, it was normal to go to war against one another. They did not recognize each other's right to exist. When the Spanish conquistadores landed in what was to be called Latin America, what did they do? They conquered the territories of the indigenous native Indian tribes. It was normal for them to do so. They did not think that it could be different, that they could act differently. And the Romans or the Greeks acted in the same way with the barbarians, the Chinese with the Mongols, and vice versa. So it was a shared culture. It was a shared culture as proven, according to Alexander Wendt, by Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War. I quoted, or I referred very quickly to Thucydides in my chapter 3. He, to some extent, is the very first classical realist when describing when analyzing his Peloponnesian War. In the Peloponnesian War, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides sums up what he calls the Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue is a dialogue between the generals of the Athenian army and the inhabitants, the people living in the city-state of Melos. The army of Athens was about to conquer militarily the city of Melos, the city-state of Melos. And this is what, according to Thucydides, the generals of the Athenian army said to the inhabitants of the city-state of Melos. This is what they said. I sum it up. You know, you people of Melos, you know as well as we do, we people from Athens, you know as well as we do, it is a shared knowledge, it is an intersubjectively held, mutually shared knowledge, belief, conviction, culture. You know as well as we do that the strong do what they can, and the weak accept what they must. We are the stronger, we do what we want, we impose our will upon you. You are the weaker, you have to accept it, or we will kill you. This is the typical Hobbesian anarchy. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer, and therefore accept what they must, because they cannot but submit to the more powerful ones. The Hobbesian anarchy prevailed in the past, up to the Middle Ages. Since the end of the Middle Ages, according to Alexander Wendt, there were two systemic Hobbesian moments, as you say, temporary periods. And in nowadays world, the Hobbesian anarchy still prevails in some very limited, specific, regional environments. So let's look at these concrete examples. Historically speaking, two Hobbesian moments re-emerged during the last centuries, since the end of the Middle Ages, during the wars of Napoleon and during World War II. Why? Because of Napoleon's behavior and because of Hitler's behavior, according to Alexander Wendt. The two behaviors were not similar completely, but they had one common point if looked at what they did through the looking glass of Alexander Wendt's social constructivist theory. What did Napoleon do and what did Hitler do? They established empires. The French Empire, the Third Reich. That is to say, they denied the right of the countries that they conquered. They denied these countries' right to exist as independent political units. Hitler and Napoleon used violence to conquer the neighboring countries. Napoleon did this with the then German entities, with Austria, with Italy, with Spain, with even Russia, or at least he attempted to do so. Hitler did the same thing with France, with the Netherlands, with Scandinavia, etc., etc. And he tried, but he failed with the Soviet Union or with Great Britain. This Hobbesian culture during the two short periods of the Napoleonic Wars and World War II was also shared by the opponents of Napoleon and the adversaries of Hitler. To defeat Napoleon, what did the British do, and the Russians and the Austrians and the Prussians? Well, they forced Napoleon to surrender unconditionally after his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. What did the Americans, the British, Churchill, and Stalin, the Soviets do? They forced Hitler to surrender unconditionally. That is to say, they put an end to the Third Reich. They denied the right of the Third Reich to exist. But, and this is important, if you come back to the degrees of internalization, this Hobbesian anarchical culture was internalized during these two periods only to the first degree. It was Hitler's behavior, it was Napoleon's behavior which forced the British, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, and then the Americans, the British, and the Soviets to behave as an enemy in order to get rid of him who denied their own right of existence. So this anarchical culture that re-emerged, this Hobbesian, anarchical culture that re-emerged temporarily during the Napoleonic Wars and during World War II was an exceptional period, only existing, only internalized to the first degree. Regarding now the contemporary world, in the contemporary world, there are some examples, very concrete examples of limited Hobbesian anarchies, regionally limited. The example given by Alexander Wendt is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why? Because Israel denies the right of the Palestinians to have their own genuinely independent state. The Israelis say that it is because the Palestinians want to destroy Israel that they cannot afford to permit a Palestinian state to exist. So it is a shared knowledge, it is a shared perception of states conceiving one another as enemies, as aiming to destroy one another. And since Israel is more powerful, it was able to impose its state and thus to deny the Palestinians the right to have theirs. The second example that we can add, which did not exist when Wendt published his theory in the 1990s, which I do feel free to add, therefore, is the war on terror, fought first by America and then more generally the Western liberal democracies, but also the Russian regime of Putin against Islamist terrorists, be it Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda, in its doctrine, in its ideology, aims at spreading the Islamic faith, in recreating the Islamic community of believers, the Ummah. In doing so, it denies the right of non-Muslims to exist as independent units, and therefore the Western world adopts the same logic and wages the war on terror in order to get rid of Al-Qaeda. And the same is true for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Iraq and the Levant. But once again, it is, well, I would say that this example of contemporary, the two examples, both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war on terror, are examples of a Hobbesian anarchy internalized to the third degree. That is to say, we cannot afford to negotiate with terrorists. We have to destroy them and vice versa. And the same is somehow true, or regularly true, after failed attempts of negotiation in the domain of the relationships between Israel and the Palestinians. So the Hobbesian anarchy was prevailing in the past. It is exceptionally existing ever since then, including in today's world, which means that a new systemic culture has been prevailing for some centuries now, since the end of the Middle Ages, and most precisely since 1648. It is the Lockean anarchy which is prevailing. The Lockean anarchy, that is to say, states conceive of one another as rivals. They do recognize each other as having the right to exist as independent units, but sometimes limited wars may break out when there are disputes, when there are quarrels, notably regarding the borders, the frontiers, that is to say, the size, the precise size of every state's surface or limits. Very concrete example to permit you to see the difference between enmity and rivalry between Hobbesian anarchy and Lockean anarchy. Let's take the example of Iraq. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran or attacked Iran. To do what? To change the border along territories, separating the two territories, also because Iraq, or Saddam Hussein at that time, was interested in controlling a part of the Iranian territory characterized by the presence of important oil fields. This war, the Iraq-Iran war, which lasted from 80 to 88, is an example of a Lockean war, a Lockean undertaking, a war obeying a Lockean logic. The aim of Iraq was not to eliminate, to destroy Iran. It merely was to change the border along the Shatt al-Arab river. In 1990, however, what did Saddam Hussein do? 2 years after, at the end of his war against Iran, he attacked Kuwait. And he annexed Kuwait as an Iraqi province. That is to say, he did not consider Kuwait to have the right to exist as an independent unit. He then here acted on the basis of a Hobbesian logic. You, Kuwait, do not have the right, you do not have the right to exist. I consider you to be part of my territory. So it is a Hobbesian undertaking. This attack, this invasion, this annexation of Kuwait provoked, you may know that, Operation Desert Storm, launched by the US on the basis of the UN, the Security Council resolution, to do what? To re-establish the sovereignty of Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm, America's war, or the war of the United Nations against Iraq to permit Kuwait to recover its violated sovereignty, is a Lockean undertaking. The aim was to re-establish the status quo. The aim was to permit the sovereignty norm that we saw in our very first chapter to be respected. However, if we, last example, take the second American war against Iraq in 2003, when George W. Bush launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, the aim pursued by George Bush was to topple, to overthrow, put an end to Saddam Hussein's regime, to establish a pro-American regime. This war, this Operation Iraqi Freedom, in other words, denied not Iraq's existence as such, but the right of Iraq to have its own domestic regime. Therefore, it was very, very close to a Hobbesian undertaking if we apply and if we accept Alexander Wendt's framework, of course. But these examples are exceptions. Why? Because most of the time, most of the states do recognize one another's sovereignty. The Lockean anarchy, to put it differently, is internalized to the third degree. To the third degree. Every state considers it normal to recognize every other state's right to exist. Take the example of France. France could put an end to the independence of Monaco or even of Luxembourg. Nobody could prevent France from invading Luxembourg. But France doesn't even think of doing so. Why? Because it considers that Luxembourg has the right to remain independent. And the same is true for any other similar example that we may find. So today's international politics in the domain of war and peace, first and foremost, is a Lockean anarchy. It is a Lockean anarchy, but according to Alexander Wendt, more and more Kantian elements are gradually emerging, more and more Kantian elements. That is to say, states, or some of them, tend to become friends rather than to remain rivals. Friends, that is to say, states who no longer even conceive of the possibility of going to war against each other. They exclude violence in their mutual interactions, and they help one another. And according to Alexander Wendt, this exists in the Western world among Western liberal democracies, that is to say, within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When there is a conflict in the strict meaning of a divergent interest between, for instance, the Americans and the French, or the French and the British, or the British and the German, or the Germans and the Italians, etc., the Spaniards and the Portuguese, war is not even conceived of as a possibility. Spontaneously peaceful resolution conflict will be privileged. And in the case of one NATO member threatened by a third-party state, an external state, a non-member state, spontaneously all the other members propose their help in order to permit the threatened state to cope successfully with the threat. In the case of Russia, threatening the Baltic states, who now are members of NATO, France, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, Norway, the US, Canada, will help the Baltic states in order to permit them to cope with the Russian threat in the case of such a threat. So the Kantian anarchy exists nowadays, but merely within NATO. And according to Alexander Wendt, the fact that NATO is a Kantian anarchy was proven by the end of the Cold War. You know what happened at the end of the Cold War? The Warsaw Pact no longer existed. It collapsed with the collapse of the USSR. NATO, however, survived the end of the Cold War, though there was no more Soviet enemy. Why? Well, according to Alexander Wendt, because precisely NATO exists not merely in order to cope with threat, but also because the member states spontaneously conceive themselves to be friends. And when the US were attacked in 2001 during the 9/11 attacks of Al-Qaeda planes hitting the World Trade Center, the then director of the French newspaper Le Monde, Jean-Marie Colombani, wrote an editorial with the following title: Nous sommes tous des Américains. We all are Americans. We all are Americans. That is to say, America was hit. America was the target of the attacks of Al-Qaeda. But we, French, and we Europeans, are Americans. We feel hit, though we are not directly hit, because we share with the Americans this kind of friendship, this kind of we feeling, this kind of same identity, which friends spontaneously feel and which therefore incites them to help spontaneously one another. So nowadays, according to Alexander Wendt, the anarchical Kantian culture is existing merely in the Western world, but it is likely to expand. That is to say, it is possible that in the more or less faraway future, the nowadays worldwide Lockean culture will turn gradually into a worldwide systemic Kantian anarchy. Why? Because of some factors, the rising interdependence among states due to the globalization process. We saw this among states and among societies. We saw this now in chapter 6. The growing importance of global commons, that is to say, if we take the example of climate change forces us to cooperate. We cannot deal with climate change unilaterally, each state acting individually. We must find common solutions. And last but not least, states more and more adopt, this is what Alexander Wendt said some 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, 25 years ago, more and more states adopt the liberal democratic regime. And therefore, we look alike. And to quote the American or the English phrase, birds of a feather flock together. That is to say, since we are similar, we spontaneously agree with one another. So the more we come close to one another, the more we have to cooperate in order to find common solutions, the more we are independent and can no longer prosper at the expense of everybody else, the more we should behave altruistically, the more we should abandon our egoistically defined national interests and replace it by altruistically defined interests, common interests, and no more a national interest. A very optimistic outlook, a somehow idealist prediction to some extent. And I cannot help from thinking that Alexander Wendt, in announcing the success of the Kantian anarchy, comes very close to liberalism in general and to idealism, the one that we saw in our chapter 2, more specifically. In doing so, Alexander Wendt somehow contradicts himself, or I feel free to say that I consider this to be a kind of incoherence. Of course, he would not agree with me, and he would have enough arguments to contradict me, of course, anyway. Why do I think there is a potential contradiction? Because on the one hand, Wendt says anarchy is what states make of it. And this is perfectly logical given the meaning of anarchy. Anarchy is a negative concept. It focuses on the fact that the structure within which states act is an empty structure. Realists claim that it is a never-ending state of war, that it is synonymous with power politics. But actually, a negative structure can be synonymous with rivalry rather than enmity, and even with friendship rather than merely a rivalry. So when one says anarchy is what states make of it, he is loyal. He respects the original meaning, the substantive meaning of anarchy as an empty structure. But then he says, well, anarchy is likely to tend towards friendship. We can expect the Kantian anarchy to prevail, even the world state to emerge. But if there is an objective, somehow objective tendency towards the Kantian anarchy, anarchy will be no more what states make of it, since they will no more be able to make of anarchy either a rivalry and all the less so an enmity, if friendship is somehow bound to triumph. If there are structural factors determining states to go closer and closer to Kantian anarchy, anarchy will be no more what states are free to make of it. There is a kind of contradiction, I think. And I think that this contradiction can be ascribed to the context of the 1990s. The context of the 1990s, which was very favorable to the triumph of liberalism after the defeat of the communist counter model. So Alexander Wendt's social constructivist theory somehow came close to liberalism, a kind of constructivist liberal synthesis emerged, also because of the success of liberalism as a theory in the discipline of international relations. A success which itself was due to the context, the historical context of the immediate post-Cold War world, synonymous with the triumph of the American democracy, the spread of democracy more generally on the world political scene. We will see this triumph and the rise, the re-emergence of a new type of liberalism in our chapter 10 next week. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's class. I wish you a great day and hope to see you soon next week again. Have a great day. Goodbye.